Who was one of the greatest Christian theologians and philosophers who's ever lived? Someone who was revered by both Catholics and Protestants, somebody who has written a lot on the topic of theology, written some of the most central and important pieces ever written. That would be St. Augustine. We are in our series on this book, Classic Christian Thinkers, written by Ken Samples. We've already looked at Irenaeus and Athanasius, and we are going to look at St. Augustine today. Augustine was born in 354, died in 430 AD, possibly the greatest Christian theologian who's ever lived. He wrote many books that were very, very important, such as Confessions, City of God, On the Trinity. And he was lauded and claimed by both Catholics and Protestants. And when I was in high school, in my senior year, I was reading more about Calvinism and theology and all that kind of stuff. And Augustine came up a lot in these discussions. And one of the things that came up a lot was his position on predestination. I'm going to go over three topics, three main areas that Augustine is well known for. One is the issue of predestination. The other is one of his arguments for God's existence. And the other is his view of evil, which was really held a little bit ahead of him by Plotinus, but he made this well known, and Augustine is the person we go to for this view of evil. So, what is the deal with predestination? Does God predestine people? Well, Augustine was well known as a debater in the Pelagian controversy. The Pelagians believed that a person could be saved on their own merit, doing their own work apart from God's grace. And Augustine was having none of this. So Augustine was arguing that our salvation is based on God's predestining desire, his will, and by grace. Earlier on in his career, Augustine believed that predestination was based more on what God foresaw and who would turn to Christ. Later on in his career, he took a stronger view of predestination and held that predestination is based not on what we do, not on our response to God, but solely on God's elective will and choice. And that is because, according to Augustine, which would be well known, especially in Reformed thinking, we are so sinful that we will not and cannot turn to God on our own. It takes a work of God to bring us to him through his grace and mercy and his predestinating power. So this was one very well-known controversy, this Pelagian Augustinian controversy about salvation and the will, the role of sin, the role of God's elective power, and all that. This is one of many areas that Augustine is well known for. Another is his view of God's existence and nature. Now, Augustine was very much a Neoplatonist, meaning he took the ideas of Plato, an ancient Greek philosopher who was the student of Socrates and the teacher of Aristotle, and applied that Platonic thinking to his own theology. There were a lot of Neoplatonic scholars in the church. Augustine was one, Anselm another, Thomas Aquinas another. And Augustine is well known for praising the Platonists. In fact, to a fault, he actually wrote another book called The Retractions. He wrote a book called The Retractions and said that he regretted how much he highly praised the Platonists. He said that there are some areas that we can learn from the Platonists and take the good that they have to offer while leaving the rest behind. And a lot of this influences overall theology. So part of his theology was proving God's existence through what now is known as necessary and eternal truths. In fact, one of his arguments for God's existence is the argument from truth. Now, we think about God's existence today, we talk about the Kalam argument, different cosmological arguments, the teleological or design arguments, the ontological arguments. Augustine, he had several arguments. We look at one today, and that is the argument from truth, which is based on these notions of eternal and necessary truths, like mathematical truths. Truths like, to use the book I was reading a little bit ago, 7 plus 3 equals 10. What is that? What are numbers? Are these truths? How are these things true? Are they made true by us? This is an interesting debate in the philosophy of religion today. There are many good books on this topic. Bill Craig has an interesting book called God Overall, where he looks at different positions on this topic. There's a 6 views book on God and abstract objects, as they're now known to be called. And the question is, what makes these things true? What makes 7 plus 3 equals 10 true? Or what makes murder is wrong true, and those kind of statements? Well, Augustine thought, well, it can't be just nature, because you can't get unchanging truths from changing nature. There's got to be something that is unchanging about this truth, and you're not going to arrive at this kind of stable, unchanging, immutable truth from something that itself is very changing. And this is a very Platonic idea. And we'd see this kind of thinking in other philosophers like Immanuel Kant, who didn't think we could arrive at necessary universal knowledge from experience. But Augustine said there's things like truth that cannot be arrived at simply through our experience of the world. And it can't be just based on our minds either, because our minds don't just make these kind of statements true. So there must be something that is eternally true in and of itself, namely God. And so God is what makes these truths true in this necessary and eternal way. And so this is one of the ways that Augustine argues for God, and it's a very well-known argument in the history of ideas and thoughts for God's existence. And it's a very interesting and obvious way that he was influenced by Plato and his thinking. Another area that Augustine is very well known for is his view of evil. Now, many people question, what is evil? How did it get here? Is God the culprit, if you would, for making evil? So if the question would go, if God created everything and evil is a thing, then didn't God create evil? Well, Augustine would say no, because he says that evil actually is not a thing in and of itself. Existence, anything that exists, is a good thing. It has perfection. It has what Aristotle would call actuality. And things that existence as such in the broad sense is like God, because God exists. God is pure, infinite being. So anything that exists is somehow like God. So Augustine would say that there can't be anything that's completely and totally evil, because it would have to exist. But insofar as it exists, it's good. Existence as itself is a good thing. So there can't be anything that's pure evil. Then what is evil? Well, for Augustine, and going back even further to other thinkers in this Platonic line, like Plotinus, evil is not a thing in and of itself. Evil is a corruption, something that's gone bad. Many examples would be, for example, a tree that's rotten, an apple that's rotten, a moth that's eaten through a garment. These things are corrupted over time, or they have a privation. And a really famous example of privation in this regard is the eye. So if the eye is supposed to have vision and be able to see properly, if it doesn't, then it's missing something that it is supposed to have, namely sight. And if it doesn't, then it has a privation or a corruption, and it's an evil. Now, there are different kinds of evil. There's moral evil. That wouldn't be the kind we see with an eye or something natural. That would be more natural or physical evil. So evil then is not a thing. It's a corruption of a thing, that a good thing that's somehow been messed up or suffers a lack of being that should be there. Like this book does not have the privation of sight. It lacks sight, but it's not an evil for this book not to be able to see, because it's not supposed to see. So that is something that's very well known about Augustine. Augustine would have many ways that he influenced the church, for both Catholics and Protestants. Reading from the Evangelical Dictionary of Theology, 2nd edition, it says, a master rhetorician, Augustine coined many sayings, still familiar today, including love and do what you will, unity in things necessary, liberty in things doubtful, charity in all things. Might harken back to what we hear about with Martin Luther. With love for mankind and hatred of sins. Often styled, it says, love the sinner, but hate the sin. Or Jesus Christ will be Lord of all, or he will not be Lord at all. Seek not to understand that you may believe, but believe that you may understand. And there are lots of things like this that Augustine said. So Augustine was very, very influential. I encourage you to get this book, Classic Christian Thinkers by Ken Samples. If you haven't been reading it, get caught up. We're not too far into it. You can still get caught up with it and read. There's an unfortunate lack in the church today about just a basic understanding of church history and historical theology. That is, how do we get to where we are today with our theology? How do we come to be where we are now with our views of various theological doctrines? Again, what this channel is made for, the reason I wanted to do this channel, besides just to have fun and talk about theology myself, is to be able to help train people and teach people about things that the church sometimes does and a lot of times doesn't do. We don't hear a lot about this in church services or in Sunday school or in discipleship groups. And sometimes people want to go further than that, and they're not going to want to go to a seminary. This is what we're doing in this channel, is to be able to train people and teach people about basic theology. And that's a great thing that this book does. This book is a wonderful book that Ken wrote. He's written many great books. But I encourage you to read it. It's really interesting. I'm not going through all the biographical material of these folks in here, but it's really interesting. We have to look forward to next time Anselm, followed by one of my favorite, Thomas Aquinas, and then Martin Luther is a hero of mine, John Calvin, Blaise Pascal, and C.S. Lewis. So grab the book, and we'll see you next time.